I think we got up to falling leaves return to the root. Who can say when they will return? Is that where we were last week? But I see many of you have returned, so not everybody went to the total root. Text continues. They further ask, who was given the treasure of genuine Dharma discernment? The Master replied, whoever realizes the way has it. Those with an unattached mind get it. They ask, will there be any troubles in the future? And the Master answered, 5 or 6 years after my passing, someone will come to take my head. Listen to my prediction. And then there's a verse. Wishing to make offerings to the parent with bowed head, food in the mouth is a must. When the difficulty of man arises, the officials will be Yang and Liu. So, a rather not so straightforward passage here to try to fathom. It doesn't say who asked. It could be Fa Hai, or it could be all of the assembled 10 that are there. Again, they're asking in different ways. In this particular case, it's a kind of technical expression, treasure of the genuine Dharma discernment, and our footnote is indicating that this is an allusion to the robe and bowl, but also has the implication that it points to someone who's accomplished and who recognizes and who's been validated and certified, so that he or she is acknowledged, but also has the ability to pass it on and recognize it in others. I want to be clear here, this next line is very important. They ask who was given this? And it still indicates a kind of sense that perhaps they still have that awakening, this understanding, this wisdom is something that's bestowed from a teacher to a student, almost, and then it carries a sort of mystical or special sort of sense about it. I was given, or I received the Dharma transmission from so-and-so. I guess in some ways parallel to the idea of passing on the crown in investiture from king or queen to prince or princess or something like that. But even if you look at that, you really have to say, so what is really transmitted there? I mean, it's then the prince or the princess learns how to act like a king or a queen. It's like nothing special that goes, even though people then say, well, they got the bloodline. And again, just people who understand genetics and everything else, that's just a hogwash. I'm sorry. I've got as much blood in my system from all the previous, including Genghis Khan, and so do you. So it's like, are you heirs to Genghis Khan because that happens to be the most distributed marker in your genetic? Nah, come on. Anyhow, I don't buy into that, and I don't think the text does either. I think the answer here is very interesting. He says, whoever realizes a way has it. Realizes, in other words, embodies it and has made it known through and of themselves rather than something that's been given. Those with an unattached mind get it. So even further he goes and says, and by the way, you really have to have, going back to his original statement, a mind that's unattached, clinging to nothing. And that means you have seen through and put down all that obstructs that full awakening of your spiritual nature. And again, you see it's not something you get, but it's the absolute letting go of all attachments and clingings. That's why this line's really important. And it also indicates that this is not, I think, this is my reading, this is not a one-time, quote, transmission or one-time passing on. I think he's giving a formula for the indefinite future, that whoever realizes the way, and whoever has this unattached mind, awakens to Anyuttara Samyaksambodhi, becomes a living Buddha or Bodhisattva. And it's not limited to time or place or history. and I'm going to make this argument a little further as the text goes on tonight on the next pages. So on one hand, his teaching, his direct teaching is to say, right here and now, all of us, each of us, have the potential to realize the way and get it. It's not that they had it then, or that we have to wait for some future date that someone magically, mystically will come along as the chosen one and carry this on. But it is ever present, ever available, even if it's not ever realized in each of us. So this is the imperative, I think, at the core of his direct teaching, that all beings have this. All beings can realize it. And one point in the text he says, why don't you right now, as you're sitting here in this present moment, awaken to your true nature? And it's not just a rhetorical question, it's a statement of confidence, but also a statement of sort of existential urgency. What are you doing? What are you doing? You waiting for Godot? Don't. So then they ask, after that, will there be any troubles in the future? Why do they ask that?
That's strange.
Huh?
It's a strange question.
It is a strange question. Will there be any troubles in the future?
I mean, they just kind of swallowed his explanation just before that whole, you know. They're like, oh, okay.
Mm-hmm.
And then they're like, what, you think there are going to be any troubles in the future?
Yeah, it's.
Why would there not be any troubles, you know?
Oh, well,
Life here.
yeah, so life is trouble. If their life goes on, there's troubles. That's certainly true. Not particularly Buddhist. It's pretty universal. But why, any other reasons they might be asking?
Maybe they feel,
Huh?
maybe they feel if you attain something that maybe you'll be free of all pain and suffering.
So with attainment may come a kind of a suffering, but they're still asking who got it. And he's saying basically you have it, you just don't realize it yet. But I know that with a little more effort and a little more final tweaking, you guys will be okay. But what's the troubles? Well, you know, go ahead.
What it made me think is that they were still looking at who the flag head now or something like that, and will there be...
A little louder, my hearing's not so great.
It kind of made me feel like they were still saying who's going to be the leader, even though he gave that answer, and like there would be troubles among, you know, who's the leader.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, so if you follow the context here, it's like, who got it? Is there this? Da-da-da. And then the question is, almost to your point, they just swallowed that and they get, yeah, but who got it? Will the troubles be infighting among ourselves? And this would follow from, if they look at his life, it was filled with troubles. I mean, there was at least, we know, 6 assassination attempts made on his life. Once he was trying to burn him out when they were pursuing him. They tried to steal the robe and bowl many times. So they're thinking, okay, here we are. That's great. You've appointed us and we're ready to go. Well, wait a minute. Are we going to be walking in the same troubled footsteps that you've been walking in? Or will we be, scot-free? It could be that. But we know that at that time, being an embodiment of this teaching was not just pure blessing. There was a lot of troubles that he had in his life, including, and we know this throughout history too, often these great teachers and sages run contrary to established authorities. They don't always get along with either ecclesiastical authority or state authority. In this case, he declined, remember, to go to visit on request of the imperial Empress Dowager and her son, because in the view of him, that would be endorsing corrupt government. They were not considered to be stellar and virtuous leaders. And so he declined to go. As he was at the end of the life, they just let him go, and they actually did a very interesting reverse psychology and said, oh, it's wonderful, wonderful, build a stoop in his honor, because he, basically they just said he just endorsed us even though he didn't. They reversed by endorsing him, indicating that therefore he endorsed them. This still goes on, by the way, this kind of stuff. Han Shan, another great teacher, was thrown into prison by the emperor, and I think his mother caught up in that. And oftentimes they're banished or eliminated. So it's not the case. I mean, it's almost more the case if you thought about it. If you're teaching this profound Dharma of liberation, there's no loyalty then to received power or fame or prestige that's associated with even high government position. You have to speak truth to power, in a sense. And you also speak truth to suffering. And wherever you find those, you just speak the Dharma. And that could put you at odds with people that don't want to hear this or want to use you in a way to enhance their power, which is clearly one of the issues that has plagued Buddhism, certainly in China and other parts of Asia, even in Sri Lanka, in Japan, where you have this conflation of religious and spiritual power. And then power tends to corrupt. And so we can see this. And you can still see it in the modern times with the attempt to control or regulate or, how should I say, appropriate religious influence, religious power, so it serves those in power and so forth. And it's not absent from our own country. There's all attempts continuously for religious groups to try to take over the rules of the state and so forth. So this is a continuing problem. Maybe that's what they're talking about too. Will there be troubles in the future?
Question.
Yes.
One more question on the will there be trouble. I don't recall the master doing a lot of prognosticating in the past. Clearly that's something he's adept at since he can see causes and conditions and they know that. But I was almost wondering, most of us can't see the future. He can. If he's on his way out, I could see them having a whole lot of questions about, hey, what's going to happen?
And so you were wondering why he doesn't do more of this, or?
No, I'm just, I guess, wondering whether it seems completely natural to them to have him step into the role of someone who sees the future, or whether this is actually something that they are suddenly aware he can do and they can't.
Good question. Good question. I'll go into this a little more tonight because there's elements in here with this that he answers. And then the next passage where he makes another prediction that could seem to us as out of the ordinary or even, quote, supernatural or having psychic abilities. And I want to make a point tonight with him and then with somebody else, another monk of a more contemporary era, who talks about this as well. And what seems to be emerging here for your consideration, I'm not going to say I'm going to convince you of this, but for your consideration that it seems as if when the full human faculties of the mind are opened and released and not inhibited, then what we take to be extraordinary or supernatural quite effortlessly becomes natural and ordinary to those who see in this way. When you don't see in this way, then it seems far out and extraordinary. When you do, they present it as very ordinary and natural. But it's meant to say that there is a range of perception, cognition, awareness, penetrating insight that's available to everyone if we cultivate and refine it. It's not like it's magical, rather it's dormant, so to speak, within the human capacity. That's how they describe what we call psychic or spiritual powers or penetrations and so forth. Not as far out and mystical, but as very evident, everyday, ordinary, except that we have collapsed this consciousness down to just a little myopic field where it says like we're looking at the world through a straw. And then, what we see is perfectly focused, but the larger, because we're collapsing our vision down to a straw, I'm using a metaphor, of course, we don't see that. But when you take the straw away, you go, oh, of course, it's obvious. But it's not. And so if somebody says to us, oh my gosh, do you You know, do you see the lights on the ceiling? You're saying ceiling, lights, what are you talking about? There's no such thing from the vision through the straw. You take the straw away, you say, oh, of course I see them. So this is how they're approaching this, and even what we would call predictions, obviously, I mean, there's case after case after case where we see evidence of this through the biographies and autobiographies going back and continuing. So I'm just saying, if we can let our minds be open a little bit to that, one, it's reported as happening, two, their explanation of it and how they deal with it is rather straightforward and ordinary in a sense, and that it's not special to these individuals, but part of the spectrum of human consciousness that we all have. And then they would probably say at different times, with different people at different stages of your cultivation in life, these sensibilities, or if you want to, I don't like the word, but for want of a better word, intuitions, are available to us. They come to us, whether in their meditation or during a walk or during particular states of our life. We understand and see things that are not just totally hyper-rational, logical, but have to do with another field of knowing and awareness. And sometimes these actually become very helpful and insightful and move us along. Sometimes we don't know what to make of them. Sometimes they're stronger and weaker, and that's interesting how that plays out. But the indications here are these are natural abilities, not supernatural attainments. Okay? So his prediction here has to do with something that he sees coming down the pipe, so to speak, and he says 5 or 6 years after my passing, someone will come to take my head. Now, at that point, they'd be thinking, oh, it's your head and not ours. So the troubles are, they're going to continue to be with you, but not us. And then he makes his prediction. The way I've heard this explained is that this is talking about a specific incident that indeed did happen after his passing. Remember, his body was put in a stupa. Remember, he said, I'm going back. They built a stupa. It was put inside a stupa. His body was such that it did not go through the normal process of decay that happens to most corpses. And as I understand it, it's still available in a mummified form. You can see it. Yeah, it's in, where is it, in which monastery? Chickenfoot? Nanhua. Nanhua's in the south, right. So you can still go see them. Some people use the mummified remains, but it's not like the mummy out of the movies. It's wrapped up, you know, it's just, but it's obviously shrunken and so forth. But in any event, I'm not even going to, what that all means, go into that, but I'm just saying he was put in the stupa, and then apparently a person by the name of Man, that's the third line, the difficulty of Man. Man was a poor peasant who, receiving some money from a Korean monk called, I think, Jindabe, who wanted the patriarch's head. And this Korean monk had considerable money, and so he hired this local character, Man, who was really poor and destitute, to go steal Sixth Patriarch's head, cut it off and bring it to him. And so that's the difficulty of Man, and you see food in the mouth is a must. Basically, when they asked Man, what were you doing? He said, my family and I were starving, and I did it for the money to feed the family. So this is a reference to the food in the mouth is a must. When you're hungry, you'll do all kinds of things that you wouldn't. But I'm talking about really hungry. I'm not talking about where you guys are tonight. You're thinking, I think we'll go out for a pizza afterwards. I'm talking like 3 weeks without food or something, that kind of hunger. Then you'll do things. And the officials will be young and loose. So what apparently happened, he wasn't a skilled headhunter. I mean, I'm using the vernacular, sorry. No double entendre intended. And he went in, and apparently they had wrapped the patriarch's neck based on this prediction. They had wrapped it in metal bands or something. So when he went in the dark with his lantern or whatever and tried to cut it, it was making this clanging sound, but it wasn't cutting it. This awoke everybody. They came out and they caught him. They arrested him, and the officials were Yang and Lu, and they said, what are we to do with this guy? And the monks at the time said, it's a dastardly deed he's done, but on the other hand, since the master predicted this would happen, we really don't want to mess with this, and they let him go. And that was the end of the story. So this is both a prediction and it seemed to come to pass. Now, I could go into something that I find kind of interesting, and I'm looking into it. It's one area of research I want to continue, which is this attraction and wanting of the actual either possessions of a sage or a saint or a teacher, or their actual body parts. Now, some of you from different traditions know that this is a universal sort of religious phenomena, a lock of hair, or a little piece of bone, or some people will say a piece of the cross on which Jesus was nailed, or the garment. All of these things, they become relics, sought after to carry immense power and blessings and so forth. You all know what I'm talking about? Yeah, I don't know if some traditions don't have it. Most of them do. I know in the Roman Catholic tradition that I came through, it was a big element, at least among certain believers, including my grandmother. And so, I mean, the whole idea of the quest for the Holy Grail is built upon this idea that if you can touch, hold, possess, you'll get the charisma, you'll get the actual power of the saint or the sage. And so in this tradition, getting the head was really it was a coup, sort of, you know. Sorry, this is just coming out tonight. I apologize. Okay. But in other cases, still, and you will still see sharira in the Buddhist tradition, it's called, which are relic remains of sages that are either put into little glass cases or distributed and was set upon the Buddha's death. The same thing happened there, that his sharira was distributed and so forth. So there's a rich, I'm curious about it. I'd like to look into it more. I've been given sharira that I have. I'm still trying to figure out what they represent and what they're about. And people that are into these actually say, because I was at the group where we went to different parts of Asia, and they have very powerful responses when they view or behold the sharira. And I'm not denying it, I just throwing it out for whatever that's about. It's very interesting. On the other hand, it seems to me to be a little bit at odds with the direct teaching. So I don't know, I'm not going to dismiss it or try to reconcile it. I just say they coexist. You have somebody says, you yourself are the Buddha nature, you can become Buddha, don't look outside. And then you have this kind of thing going on too. And it's just something I'm interested in. I don't have an answer for it. And I don't say one is true or false or anything. I've seen aspects of both that are, really interesting and true. So I'm not sure what this all means. You could say, oh, well, it has psychological meaning. And maybe that's all it is. You feel an identity with someone who's passed, who was important to you, who was holy, and you feel by being near to them in some way. On the other hand, you can see in Buddhism that ashes to ashes, dust to dust. Why is everybody making so much fuss over something that's just blood and pus? I mean, it's sort of like, but anyhow.
Marty, is that similar to just having something that's consecrated, beads or,
But again, this is right. So this is the thing. I can remember when I was in Borobudur as a monk, and we had lunch with some monks, and it was on a little platform. There was about 15 of us, and the lay people came and made the offerings, and they sat on the side as we ate, and as soon as we finished and got off the platform, they swarmed the platform and started just eating up all the scraps and leftovers, really ravenously. Not because they were hungry, but because somehow there was mojo in the food that had just been offered to the monks. And they're thinking like that. And I was like, whoa, what was this? But the other monks who were native to the area just said, oh, this is normally how it goes. So the idea of consecration, literally consacra, with the sacred. What does that mean? And how is that bestowed? Because, again, when I was traveling throughout Asia, it's very common for people to come up and want your blessing, want you to touch their rosary or rub their head, or most commonly bless their children. And I could have made a fortune if I really had that power, because a lot of children that need some mojo help. But anyway, but the question then arises, what is consecration? What makes something, quote, sacred? And again, if you look at the Sixth Patriarch, he's saying the straight mind, the true mind, that's the sacred. That's the holiness. That's the monastery. And then you have this idea that it's bestowed from outside. So here in this passage, it's almost like saying, no, I'm not going to pass it on. I'm not going to consecrate. I'm not going to do that outside kind of manifestation. You all have it within. You understand the way you clear your mind, you got it. And yet, right within that, they're making a stupa to preserve. And so this is very interesting, something to you all to think about. Yes?
Can I try out a thought?
Sure.
It's not very developed method, sorry.
Sometimes the best thoughts are the ones that are least developed.
So, when you said that you don't know of any, you couldn't think of any tradition that doesn't do relic worship type thing?
Somewhat?
You said you couldn't think of a tradition that doesn't do relic worship so much?
Not immediately.
Right. Well, the immediate one comes to mind is when I grew up in Protestant Christianity. It was just the taboo. Like, you wouldn't do any image, nothing material comes into the religious life. And if there's something material, it's, it's just ritual.
Mm-hmm.
And I always wonder whether actually having the physical elements in the religious experience, in the Buddhist case, actually could counterbalance, because otherwise the idea that it's all within could become kind of intellectualism, which in a way Protestantism becomes, right? Because it's about the articles of belief. And the idea that, I'm whole and complete in myself, the idea that as a doctrine, people, sort of attached to that, but as a doctrine, as a teaching, it's still outside of yourself, rather than actually just embodied.
It's interesting, too, if you understood what he was saying. On the other hand, that not intellectualizing it could err and go over to the other side of sort of mystifying it as another other power phenomena, and then take you completely out of the realm of self-determination or spiritual self-determination. So it's really tricky. But I was also thinking of people have written about the Protestant tradition along these lines and saying, you're absolutely right, there's no really iconography and there's no worshiping of, and yet the hunger for signs, the hunger for something to show that you are confirmed and in the right is a very powerful underlying thirst in the Protestant tradition. And some people, Max Weber, for example, would make an argument that the thirst for some sign that you were saved, that you were in the elect saved group, was so strong that it led to the rise of capitalism, to the rise of economic materialism. If you could make your way in the world and show that you could be successful, it wasn't proof that you were saved, but it was a pretty good marker that you were in the light, in the blessed light. So it created a kind of hunger for sign and redemption. And that thirst or hunger, say from David Lloyd's perspective, who's writing about Buddhism, he calls the sense of lack, then leads to a thirsting. So it's really complicated what we're looking at here. You could maybe use one of these relics as a source of inspiration to cultivate yourself and say, I'm going to walk in the footsteps, or you could use it as a sort of, how should I say it?
Sense of accumulation.
Well, accumulation or a spiritual materialism, or as a cop-out for your own cultivation and just say, as long as I got this, I'm saved. So it's really complex in terms of the actual, anyhow, I didn't mean to open that can of worms tonight. I just thought it was really interesting. Yeah, or can of relics, so to speak. So, Master also said, 70 years after I leave, 2 bodhisattvas will come from the east. One will be a monk, the other a layman. They will actually teach as contemporaries, establishing my teaching, restoring the monasteries, and enabling the Dharma to flourish for posterity. Okay, so this again is another prediction of after he passes, one will be a layperson, the other will be a monk. Again, as the record records us, this is referring to the famous Chan Patriarch Madzu, who then later came and established a lot of monasteries and became a very famous teacher. And different accounts have different explanations who the layman was, but one is it's the famous layman Pang, who with himself and his daughter, the whole family, were cultivators of the way, who did not leave home life, but did it at home.
So is that the reason why you think he's giving that prediction? Is that sort of just setting himself within a larger historical framework of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas?
It's an interesting question here, because I think what seems to be going on here, and I'm glad you asked that, is like, here he is, the Sixth Patriarch, positioned as the teacher to these disciples. He's there, he's present. They've known him and they've understood him. And now as he's passing, both in terms of both being kind and compassionate, saying, I'm not really leaving you. I'm going to leave stuff behind for you to work on. I have confidence in you. So it's like they're bereft and abandoned. And by part of the way he does this is by moving backward and forward in time and events to indicate a continuum rather than an abrupt here and then gone. For example, the predictions now are the forward-looking. In the future, and he said, remember, the seed will flourish and the flowers will come. So he gives that. It's a very confident, forward-looking thing. And then he says this difficulty will happen, and then he says these bodhisattvas will come. So there's a sense of continuity. And you will go on. From your 10 more will come, and so forth. And now the next part, he's going to go backwards. And he's going to say, because they asked the question, please tell us on the next page how many generations have passed along the teaching since the Buddhas and Patriarchs appeared in the world. And so now he's doing a continuity, saying, I am here now, but before me there were these. And to me this is very interesting, because it's almost like the expression often used when people chant is the eternally dwelling triple jewel, meaning ever present, ever existing, from beginningless time to endless future. It is a continuous, unbroken phenomenon, or whatever you want to call it, but it doesn't have a point of origin, nor does it have a point of ending. So this is a very interesting, and what he's doing is saying, as he said earlier, remember they asked him about his teaching, he said, I am merely passing on what I have learned from before. This is not my teaching. And then he goes even further and he says, in fact, what the teaching is simply the untying of the knots, the ending of human suffering, however it manifests. And that untying of the knot is the teaching. So he's not even sort of, I'm passing along a writ or a dogma, but I'm passing along a methodology of liberation. Now this is interesting, because that would mean then that the passing along is a technique and a process and not a product. It's not a thing, but it's a yung, an activity, a using of something. So it's a skill. And this is very interesting, because then, as long as that skill is being applied and as long as it's liberating, then the teaching continues, regardless of whether, quote, it's written down or not, or even in these hard relics. So this is very, very interesting. So if he goes and go into this, he says, first line, since the past, numberless Buddhas have responded to the needs of the world, too many to be counted. This is a very interesting response. Numberless Buddhas. So when we think of what we're doing here, we think of Shakyamuni Buddha, the Prince Siddhartha who became, and we know the story. And he's saying that's one of numberless Buddhas. Wow, okay. And they have responded to the needs. Now this is interesting. They don't just come and say, okay, here I am, the Buddha. They come in response to needs. This is very interesting because then if the needs differ and vary over time and place and culture, then the manifestation of the response would have to be appropriately that way. So this leads me to a very interesting kind of question. We think, oh, Buddhism originated in India, and we have this India-centric model. You may or may not want to buy into that, but the text itself seems to be suggesting, this is not the only text that suggests this, is that that is only our present historical context for how this Buddha appeared at this world at this time for us. So, I often have the question, well, what if, say, at this time, the Buddha came in Athens instead of India, or appeared in Europe instead of India? Would the teachings be the same, or would they be different? Or let's say, didn't appear then, but appeared in 1600 in America. That's when the Buddha manifested in the world. Whoa. So would he be talking about Atman or something else? Where would be the tie, the knot that they would have? Because that's what I'm trying to trans-historicalize this and just get out of the set that this is an Indian-centered thing that happened at this particular time, and the best way to understand it is to go back to then and do that. But I'm just trying to interpret what the Sixth Patriarch's presenting here. He's suggesting that this is a phenomena that responds to the needs of living beings, among which are human beings, over an infinite time and space, and therefore responds to the needs in the appropriate way at that appropriate time, appropriate space, to that appropriate culture, those people at the time, how they arrange their social relational field, how they arrange their economic political order, how their deep thought ways and their orientations, their Weltanschauung, their worldview is set up. Then the Dharma comes in response to that, where it's conducive to their liberation. That teaching then feeds off of those, responds to those, uses it. And when it's not, it challenges and takes them into question. But it's in that condition that it arises, not as a sort of dropped on universally over all time. So I'm just thinking we have to stretch our minds a little here, because what he's saying, he says, for the moment, I'll just talk about the last 7 Buddhas. The last 7? Prior to Shakyamuni. And then he goes, in the past adorned aeon. Anybody want to give me the date of that?
Do you even know if this is a singular world versus plural?
Good question. Good question. Is it a singular word or plural? Because if you're going to look, okay, so Shakyamuni Buddha is roughly when? Let's not have a big debate, but roughly. You guys have been conditioned to bite your tongues, because if you do, somewhere 300-500 before the Common Era, right? So if he's got 7 Buddhas going back, we in deep past history here we're almost into prehistory, prehistoric. So what was going on? Where were they? If they weren't in India, and they weren't in America, obviously, because that's not the adorned eon. And what's an aeon? It's a kalpa. What's a kalpa? Long time, thank you. Yeah. By some calculations, 17 to the 5th power million. Okay, so what's being presented to us here is a mind-blowing thing. Wait a minute, you're saying, oh yeah, the Buddha was about 500 or 400 BCE, and then it went to Central Asia, and they say, yeah, fart. That's like looking at one little star in our galaxy and saying, that's it. And you say, oh my God, there's billions of stars. There's more stars that we can observe in our little bitty galaxy than there are grains of sand on the entire Earth. And that's only one galaxy. So just as we have had our minds blown about who we are and where we're positioned in a vast space, he's doing the same thing here. And because he says, who are they? And the aeon is I cannot but conclude, prior to what we call our history and prior to what we call our world. Vipashan, Shikyan, Vishvabu, And then in the present distinguished aeon, Krakachananda, Kanakamuni, Kashyapa, and Shakyamuni. So what about the three that came in this present aeon? Where were they? Who were they? What were they teaching? Where's the record? And then he says, these are the seven Buddhas called the seven Buddhas of antiquity. Antiquity doesn't indicate how far back it goes. Then he goes through and he says, from that Shakyamuni Buddha, then it goes through and he goes through this long list up to Venerable Bodhidharma becomes the first in China. Then you have Hui Ke, Sangsan, Daoxin, Hongren, and finally him. So he's doing both immediate lineage from Shakyamuni down, but then he's doing this mind-stretching thing that goes, whoo. Yes?
Is he personifying these time periods when he says adorned and distinguished, and it's almost like, well, those adjectives would be used to describe a person or an entity, but he's also talking about a time period. Right?
If you look into some of these texts like, say, the Avatamsaka, or even as alluded to in this text, there's a sense of history going on here that our history does not compass, what we call history. But it's not that it's lacking, it's just a whole different look at what history and time is. And what these aeons are and where they are from the perspective of our history, which is the recorded history, say, a few hundred years maybe before the Common Era or whatever, up to the present, is hardly a blip on the radar screen of the history that's being talked about here. So what those aeons are and why they got that name is part of a larger historical record that the texts talk about. But to us, they're mythical. We see them as mythical. But it's interesting that even in our lifetimes, things that we took as mythical, for example, some of the early periods of Chinese history that we assumed were just mythical, we've now discovered that in fact there are historical artifacts to confirm that they existed, that things were going on then. So again, what I'm saying, this whole thing about the predictions and going forward and backward here is presenting to us in a sort of matter-of-fact way a view, an understanding of time and space that we can't concretize with our minds as they currently operate. And so the question is, what do we make of this? What do we do with this? And what do these represent? And you could ask, and were they really real? But based on what?
Does this have to do with Buddhist cosmology that was pretty much accepted maybe in the ancient times? Like when it says eons and all this, it may not be just restricted to this universe we know, but it also includes something outside of known universe.
But see, when even using those language outside of what universe? At one time, the universe consisted of the earth at the center, and then this kind of sphere around it that we could see with our human eyes, and that was the world and the universe and everything under heaven. And then, like Galileo works with a couple of lenses, puts them together and goes, oh my God, look at that. And it's like, whoa. And now we got Hubble out there, and we're going, oh my God, we're seeing to the edge of the edge of the universe? What are you talking about? Where's the edge? And if there's an edge, what's beyond the edge? It's like, so our human mind that's constricted in some ways by me and mine only sees, but with some instruments we can see more. So now we realize, well, the earth isn't actually the center. We think the sun's the center, but the sun's not actually the center either. It's just a particular sun of our particular solar system, and there's hundreds of millions of those. So where's the center of the universe? I am. I have felt that way since I've been 2 years old. You all revolve around me. So that's not even geocentric, that's egocentric. But I'm just saying, we're ethnocentric or homocentric or anthropocentric in that we think we are the measure of all things, and then time was beginning when we started recording, quote, time, and the universe is as far as we can see. And then, of course, with microscopes, we're starting to see, oh, there's these little things called germs and bacteria that cause disease. You're going, of course. Well, for a long time, that wasn't a course. That was madness to talk about little things you couldn't see causing illness. You were locked up for that. And now you get Nobel Prizes. So, it's sort of like we have to then ask ourselves, with a text like this, or something like the Avatamsaka, can we suspend our immediate judgment, either saying, oh, I absolutely believe it, yes, indeed, or no, absolutely not, and just say, we're being challenged here to examine the grounds of our epistemology, how we know things, and how valid that might be. And it's actually causing us to stretch a little bit. And I think that's what he means by cultivating a relaxed, unattached mind, is to recognize that much of what we understand to be as it actually is a lot of projection, either conscious or unconscious, and also part of the limitations of our sensory organs, and we presume those to be the measure of all things, right? So what this is about is really, anyhow, what I wanted to do tonight, I'm not going to get to. So what I'm going to do next week, geez, sempre mañana. What I'm going to do next week is I wanted to bring in a record, a biography of a forest monk, a relatively of our era, late 19th, early 20th century, who in his own way records events and happenings in the process of his cultivation that both sort of correspond to what we're discussing here, but in a much more immediate present way of the contemporary times. And I just want to share some of those events with you to sort of see what's going on here. And the interesting thing, what's going on, he never sees any of this as extraordinary or far out. And I'm reading and going, oh, wow. But he's just like, and then this happened, then I had lunch, and then this happened. And you go, wait a minute, which world, which universe is he talking about here? Oh, and then one of Shakyamuni's disciples came and talked to me and gave me a lecture. It was wonderful. I even remember I took some notes on it after. But you're late 19th, 20th century, and those were, and he doesn't say like, wasn't that something? He says, no, it was really wonderful. I mean, I'd never had a Dharma talk like that before. I mean, but he presents it, and he's not the only one. So what I wanted to do is to say, when people begin to cultivate the understanding and expanding of the mind and its states and release the inhibitions we put on our human consciousness, these things naturally, not supernaturally, but naturally start to open up and become available. And those who experience it as just as you and I are sitting here talking and listening and looking at each other, not something extraordinary. And what are we to make of that then in terms of what he just did here tonight, going backwards in time and making predictions going forward? It seems like it's a very ordinary kind of happening. But at the same time, I'm not promoting, I'm not trying to promote a dismissal of this because it doesn't match our super empirical, positivistic, scientific framework now, which I think is a kind of wonderful straw. Nor am I saying you should just like, oh yes, it's so wonderful, I can't wait for my eyes to open, I see all these things. Or I just believe it. But rather just allow a kind of, what's the word I want to use? A dynamic tension that I don't have enough data and I don't have enough instruments at my disposal yet to confirm or deny this. But I can rest with being open to looking at this, investigating, both looking at it in terms of reading these texts more and understanding them, but also maybe cultivating my instruments of understanding, my own sense organs, my own mind, and see if that combination can't make this a little more understandable, maybe even accessible. So anyhow, that's next week, I promise. Actually, and I didn't print it out. I brought my little laptop computer because I thought it'd be a little easier than printing it out on paper. So next week I will go right into that because it does. Okay? I was going to do it tonight, but it didn't happen. Any announcements? Of course, I could, once again, one of my favorite lines from Hamlet. When Hamlet sees his father's ghost, and gets this message, and then the guards see the ghost, but Horatio says, "Are you on mushrooms or something?" And then Hamlet says to Horatio, "Horatio, there are more things to heaven and earth than are dreamed of in your philosophy." And at that time, philosophy was the natural science. And so he's saying, what you use to measure and see things true, your natural philosophy, is not all there is, Horatio. So I could see the Sixth Patriarch saying to us, there's more things to heaven and earth in the Dharma realm than are dreamed of in your science.
So tomorrow we have 7:30 p.m. Avatamsaka lecture given by Rebbe Hank Scher. We'll be online streaming from Australia. And also tomorrow we will starting the 3 days Amitabha session, this Buddha's recitations name here session from 8 a.m. to 4:30 p.m.
Tomorrow.
So tomorrow we're starting from Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. So everyone is welcome.
What's Monday? Chan?
Amitabha session here.
Through Monday. 3 days?
Monday, 3 days.
Oh.
President's Day.
What's that?
It is holidays, day off on Monday for most.
For most people. I never get it. What is the holiday that's supposed to be?
President's Day.
Well, let's hope it's past presidents. Oh, sorry. The presidents of antiquity.
And more event you can check in our website, berkeleymonastery.org.
But people aren't staying here, they're coming and going.
They're coming and going, and there will be lunch provided from 11 to 12, and we will recite in Buddha's name. And actually, will be also the Jinchuanshi, one of our monks, will give some introduction for this practice from 8 to 8:40, from 9 to 9:40. Sorry, 9 to 9:40.
So there's just a word about, this is one particular practice of, they say 84,000, which just means a big number, like an aeon, that people use to actually cultivate their own minds. Now you could see it as, oh, this is a devotional exercise to a Buddha long ago, far away, called Amitabha. But in fact, and we went over that in this text, the way the Sixth Patriarch takes it, he says, the Pure Land is just your here and now space, and Amitabha's your pure mind. It's your true mind. And so, because the mind is actively just engaged, grabbing, grasping, fearing, rejecting, anxious, everywhere, it can't get the true mind. It can't see that true nature. And so reciting the name of Amitabha single-mindedly just over and over again, which could seem to you be sort of some incantation, is really nothing more than the Patriarch says, using poison to fight poison. You hold that single-minded recitation and you temporarily interrupt the flow of the monkey mind. And in the very interrupting of the flow of the monkey mind, something happens. And in that very stopping, awakening occurs because you're cutting off the discursive stream of ordinary consciousness. So it's actually a kind of a trick, but the thing is you can't do it as a trick, you have to do it sincerely, otherwise your mind will say, oh, you're trying to trick me, and the monkey mind will go again. So you have to just single-mindedly lose yourself in the recitation, and when you do, and the text says that very stopping of the mad mind is awakening. At the moment that mind stops. So it's almost like our habitual tendencies to be grasping, thinking, analyzing, objecting, planning, manipulating, scheming, worrying, future, past, blah, blah, blah. That activity, ironically, is the very ground of awakening, but not until it's quieted, not until, and so the recitation that he's talking about if done, 1 day, 3 days, however long, if you really do it sincerely, consciousness can shift and open. Not because Amitabha came and infused something into you, but rather by using it, you actually stop the mad mind for maybe just one thought, or 2 thoughts, or 3 thoughts. And it says if you can do this continuously, thought after thought, you're awakened. And after a while, once you get access to that, you don't have to use the technique to stop it anymore because you figured out, oh, I've overrated its active working to the nth degree. So I just want to explain that you understand there's different ways to do this recitation, but the mind ground way of doing it is just what I described, which is actually born from the Sixth Patriarch. And if you activate it in that way, you're using what's called your own power. You're using your own power, not the other power. But the ironic thing about it is they're not two when you do them right. Sonia.
A little like the Sharia thing.
Say that again?
It's reminding me of the relic thing. Why do we have these kind of external things? Well, why are we reciting Amitabha's name and not just anything at all? Is there sort of
Now,
is actually that name?
well, I can understand using the name to calm the mind. So then when the mind is quiet, then I still have trying to figure out how you would use the relic in that way. How you would use relics in a mind-grown way, I'm not sure. I'm not saying you can't. I'm open to listening, but I don't understand how that, unless in that absolute devotion to the relic, you were on the mind ground, cleansing your klesha, and actually stopping the mad mind. But if you were actually using it to seek and want, then you were activating the mad mind rather than quelling it. So this is the whole idea that has to do with intentionality. How you use a particular dharma can be a gate of liberation or a gate of enslavement, depending on the intentionality and how you use it. But it's not the gate itself that is magical. It's the mind that makes it work. So if I could figure that out on relics, I don't know, but maybe there's a way.
So basically we're walking and reciting the Buddha's name, Namo Amitabha, Namo Amitofo. And we were sitting and reciting and sitting also in silence, and people can continue in their mind, heart, the recitation. And it's a few blocks like that in the morning and afternoon after lunch.
Okay, we're going to do the transference.
Because